Hey there, Patreon viewers. So this is one of my Patreon videos. This won't be going on the main channel. The reason I'm putting it on here is, so this video is going to be about the Wallace, William Wallace sword, the two-handed sword associated with William Wallace, which definitely isn't William Wallace's sword, which I've spoken about before. But the reason I'm doing this as a Patreon video is because I'm actually researching something for a video I'm making for the main channel, and I can't possibly go into this level of detail for that video. So I thought I'd share some of what I've stumbled across with you guys. This is essentially from something called the Wallace book by Edward Cowan, and I'll put a link to what I'm reading from below. And there's a section, chapter 11, which is titled The Wallace Sword, by David H. Caldwell. I'm not sure whether I know David Caldwell. I probably should, but anyway, he seems to have done good research, and I have I've read most of this stuff before, but a long time ago anyway. I re-stumbled across the material, and I have, as I've mentioned to many of you in the past, I have asserted that the William Wallace sword that's held in Stirling Castle is definitely not Stirling Monument, the Wallace Monument at Stirling, is definitely not a sword that could have even possibly been used by William Wallace, because it's just completely the wrong style. It's not even a very convincing sword as a sword, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But this actually this attracted a certain amount of vitriol from Scottish people who viewed this video, and not just Scottish, but people who felt emotionally invested in that icon. And that's what it is. It's a symbol, and it's not an artifact. Well, it's an artifact in a sense that it's from sort of 19th century onwards, associated with William Wallace, but it's not associated with the real William Wallace. Anyway, this chapter, called The Wallace Sword by David H. Caldwell, starts, "Big men have big swords. None comes any bigger for the Scots than William Wallace, so it can be no surprise that the sword enshrined in the National Wallace Monument at Stirling is a large weapon, technically a two-handed sword." And that's the first point to make, is that this type of large two-hander just didn't really exist at the time that William Wallace was running around fighting the English. So we're talking about the 1290s or 1280s through to about just after 1300. To say that two-handed swords absolutely didn't exist isn't exactly right. There was something called a bearing sword at this time, although it has to be said the earliest bearing swords that I'm aware of actually date to a bit later, more like the middle of the 1300s. But there are some bearing swords from the 1300s which are giant two-handed swords, but what they are really are oversized longswords that are made for processional ceremonial purposes. They're not fighting weapons. There's a famous one associated with Edward III in Westminster Abbey, for example, that's sort of up on one of the columns in Westminster Abbey. I have to be honest, despite the fact I've lived in London my whole life, I've never actually seen it. I've never actually been in Westminster Abbey myself, which I really need to do. It's on my to-do list, but I've seen photographs of it and read things about it. Anyway, let's go back to William Wallace's sword. This author, Caldwell, says nobody has doubted that a sword was the weapon for Wallace. While swords were expensive and may have been relatively rare among the rank and file in Wallace's time, someone of his rank and stature surely couldn't have managed without a sword. There are a few misnomers there. I don't think swords were particularly uncommon by this date. Certainly by the 14th century, basically everybody could afford a sword. But anyway, what's interesting is that this author Caldwell then goes on to give a few sort of references to William Wallace, historical references to Wallace using a sword, and in these it seems to imply that it would be a one-handed sword that he's using, and of course that would normally be the case, because most swords in the 1290s and 1300 were one-handed swords. Yep, there may have been proto-long swords or hand-and-a-half swords starting to appear by that date, and in fact we know there were, because they're shown in art from about the 1260s, 1270s onwards. But so he could have had a longsword technically, but absolutely most swords were still one-handed swords used with a shield. He goes on to say the Wallace monument, completed in 1869, clearly needed a relic of the nation's favourite hero to heighten the feeling of awe and reverence amongst the visitors. Mementos and relics of other famous Scots, including Robert the Bruce, Mary Queen of Scots and Bonnie Prince Charlie, we would normally know him as, were conveniently coming to light as more and more interest was being taken in Scotland's past. Now, to put that into context, in the second half of the 19th century, the sense of Scottish nationalism and identity was really being forged and kind of really cemented, and so a lot of, you know, the uniforms we see associated with Highland regiments and things like this, for example, were really being nailed down, and the idea of what traditional Scottish dress is that's worn at weddings and other civic occasions was being nailed down. That's why it's essentially Victorian. And at the same period, they were building monuments, and there were stories being written about William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, and Sir Walter Scott, for example, was writing things. And excuse me for the pinging messages, that's actually Raffaello Metatron messaging me. Fuck off, Raffaello. Actually, he might see that because he's a patron on this channel, and I'm a patron for him. Yeah, so this period was really the romanticism and the identity and patriotism of Scots was really being cemented at that time. And unfortunately, lots of myths got rolled into that, and they were really looking for objects and you know, icons, to go back to the word I used at the used for things which they could kind of almost like holy relics for their sense of national identity. Now, I should throw in at this point, some people out there may be viewing this in Scotland and thinking that I'm viewing this from a very English point of view. Undoubtedly that's partially true. But I try to be as impartial as possible. I consider myself Southern English. However, I should point out that at this period in the Victorian era, in the second half of the 19th century, my own great-great-grandfather was the chief of Glasgow Police. I am 1/8 Glaswegian, or 1/8, not even Glaswegian actually, I'm 1/8 Scottish from Ayrshire. And my great-great-grandfather was the chief of Glasgow Police. And there's a monument to him in the necropolis in Glasgow. His brother established the Royal Veterinary College in Glasgow, and you know, I'm aware that a chunk of my ancestry, 1 in 8 of my ancestors, come from that part of Scotland, and in fact they held a non-aristocratic title of Freeman of Newton, and the Freeman of Newton allegedly, supposedly, were given that title by Robert the Bruce for their services rendered against the English. So my ancestors fought against the English on the Scottish side. So there we go. For all I know, the evidence would suggest that some of my ancestors fought for Robert the Bruce. But coming back to this, it is conspicuous that there are a number of two-handed swords, Robert the Bruce's and William Wallace's being the most famous ones, but there are at least a couple of others that are associated with Scottish heroes from the early beginning of the 14th century, which makes no sense because these are two-handed 16th century style swords. What's the natural conclusion? The natural conclusion is that in the 19th century they obtained 16th century two-handed swords, because these were seen lowland two-handed swords mostly, or no, in one case there's a Highland claymore, because they were associated with Scottish identity. People in the late 19th century didn't know very much about what medieval Scots were using, and they thought that they were using these big two-handed swords when actually they were 200 to 300 years out of date, or kind of futuristic. And so they got these swords from the wrong century, and they invented associations. Now, the Robert the Bruce sword is a particularly contentious one because it hasn't been on public display, but the family own it. Now, why does the family own a 16th century lowland two-handed sword and believe that it belonged to their ancestor Robert the Bruce, when Robert the Bruce lived 250 years before the date of that sword? either they obtained a sword in the 16th century and decided to call it Robert the Bruce's sword, or one of their other ancestors in the 16th century owned this sword, and 100 years later someone in the family wrongly interpreted it as being Robert the Bruce's sword. That's probably what happened. Anyway, it's very sad because lots of people are invested in these things, and I feel defensive of those people because it's a lie. It's a myth, and I like to debunk myths. I don't think that having pride in something that's wrong and false is something that's worth defending. William Wallace's sword is not William Wallace's sword. Robert the Bruce's sword is not Robert Bruce's sword. Robert the Bruce's sword. Why lie about this? Anyway, so this article is very interesting. So yeah, it says that, you know, during the late 19th century, with this kind of revival of Scottish identity and Romanticism and the Gothic revival all over Britain, a lot of these weapons associated with the Scottish heroes were coming to light. So it says, on the 17th of November 1888, with due ceremony, the Wallace sword was presented to the Reverend Charles Rogers in Stirling Castle by Colonel Nightingale, the commander of the garrison, acting on instructions from the Secretary of State of War. It was Rogers who had petitioned for the sword to grace the monument, the realisation of which was largely owing to him. This must have been a considerable moment of triumph for Rogers, the importance of which he was determined should be understood by the populace at large. As is evidenced by contemporary press cuttings in the library of the National Museums of Scotland, he was very successful in having his explanation of the sword and its significance widely reported. It's only fitting that we quote his words in length. Published in 1889, it says, "The sword is associated with a glorious history, for it was wielded by one who, in his age, when principle succumbed to expediency, was pure and without reproach, who never yielded allegiance where it was not strictly due, and who resisted oppression to the death, consequent on two weldings, the weapon has been reduced from its original length, but it was originally a noble blade, which in respect of the owner was, in a poet's word, fit for an archangel to wield, yet light in his terrible hand." And it goes on and on and on and on, and is really long. And so the author of this article, Caldwell, summarises, so Rogers's case was that the sword has been misdated by the expert, who is Samuel Merrick, to a later era, i.e. the 16th century, on the basis of a restoration that Rogers believed had been done to the sword in 1505. So Rogers asserts in his article that this two-handed sword that looks like it's from the 16th century, which he'd asked Sir Samuel Merrick, who was at the time the arms and armour expert of the age, and Samuel Merrick went, yeah, it looks like a 16th century two-handed sword, quite rightly. And Rogers went, but it was restored in 1505. So actually what we've got is an original blade with a replaced 16th century hilt. The author, Caldwell, says, despite his ingenious spin, no serious scholar has in recent times been inclined to give the Wallace sword any credence as the hero's own. It's generally well known that two-handed swords came into use long after Wallace's time. The earliest documentary reference to a two-handed sword in Scotland comes in government instructions for the arming of the Lièges, issued weeks after the disaster at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. I mean, as you'd expect, these big two-handed swords are a thing of the 16th century. And the two-handed sword occurs in a list of weapons, perhaps at the time now deemed acceptable for the army as an alternative to pikes. They'd probably been around since the late 15th century. I think that's probably correct, what Caldwell writes. There we might be tempted to leave the story of the Wallace sword. Yet another example of a relic of the wrong type and the wrong date comes to light. In my opinion, however, it's worth re-examining Rogers' account of the sword and the sword itself, which remarkably seems to have escaped detailed scholarly examination since the time of Samuel Merrick. Why? Well, because of course Scotland had been treated quite terribly in the 18th century, and so in the 19th century the British government wanted to treat Scotland nicely. So therefore, when they had this sword come to light, which was associated with the national hero, no one really felt inclined to question this, because if it makes the Scots feel better about themselves and make them feel happier about being in the British Union, then of course, yeah, you're going to let sleeping dogs lie, so to speak. But all arms and armour experts know that the Wallace sword could not have been William Wallace's. Now, this is interesting. The explanation of why William Wallace's sword should have ended up in Dumbarton Castle is plausible but mere supposition. It appears that the earliest record of its presence, so it was in Dumbarton Castle before it was at the Stirling Monument, so it was found in Dumbarton Castle and given to the Stirling Monument. It appears that the earliest record of its presence in Dumbarton Castle is in an inventory of May 1644, by which time it would have already been about 100 years old, which lists one old two-handed sword without a scabbard in the Wallace Tower. Now, the Wallace Tower, that makes you think. The Wallace Tower was one tower within Dumbarton Castle. This tower was erected in 1617, primarily to protect the northern entry to the castle. Why this structure should have been named the Wallace Tower is unknown. It's not clear. It probably has nothing to do with William Wallace whatsoever, but you can start to see, if this anonymous sword was stored in a place called the Wallace Tower, and Wallace is not an uncommon name, you can see why some people might start to refer to it as the Wallace sword. You start to see how this mistake might have occurred. The general assumption is, of course, that it commemorates Wallace, but we're not aware of any tradition that would associate him directly with Dumbarton Castle. It seems unlikely that the tower should have been named from the sword. The converse has been considered a distinct possibility, so it's far more likely that the sword was known as the Wallace sword because it was from the Wallace Tower. And we don't know of any connection between the Wallace Tower in Dumbarton Castle and William Wallace. They seem to be completely unrelated. When William Wordsworth visited Dumbarton Castle with his sister Dorothy in 1803, they were taken into the guardroom and shown a large rusty sword which they called Wallace's sword. This appears to be the earliest identification of the Dumbarton Castle sword as having belonged to William Wallace. Now, while the two-handed sword in Dumbarton Castle in 1644 might reasonably be the sword delivered to the be considered as the sword delivered to the Wallace Monument in 1888, serious doubts must be entertained as to whether it is the Wallace sword repaired in 1505, which there are records of, with the addition of a new hilt, pommel and other fittings. It's difficult to believe that anyone at the beginning of the 16th century would have accepted, in 1505, which is probably earlier than this sword dates from, would have accepted a two-handed sword as William Wallace's sword. They would have known that it was a recent sword, because in 1505 that massive two-handed sword that was being refurbished wouldn't have been an old sword. The craftsman who worked on it was Robert Selkirk, who was a cutler in Edinburgh, and none of Selkirk's work is known to survive, unfortunately, but payments recorded to him in the treasurer's accounts indicate that he produced work of the highest quality. Now, it's worth noting the work on the sword now called William Wallace's sword is not of high quality. It's in fact of really low quality. So that doesn't seem to marry up. So the record of William Wallace's sword being refurbished in 1505 does not and cannot seem to marry up with the two-handed sword now at the Wallace Monument. Firstly, because that sword seems to date to after 1505, but also because we know that the person that refurbished the sword in 1505 was a very high-quality craftsman, and the craftsmanship we see on the two-handed sword at the Wallace Monument is not a high-quality workmanship at all. It goes on with more detail. As I mentioned, I'll put the link below so you can read this whole article yourself. It goes, Samuel Merrick, he talks a little bit about Samuel Merrick. So Samuel Merrick was the arms and armour expert of his day, and it says Samuel Merrick's lengthy statement is capable of more than one interpretation. Rogers believed that Merrick was comparing the fittings, especially the pre-1825 grip, to those of the state sword of the Earl of Chester. Now, this gets complicated because Merrick seems to be comparing a sword with a completely different type of sword, so it injects a sort of ambiguity into what Merrick was actually comparing what with what, but I'm not going to go into that because that's kind of often a tangent. So, yeah, there's an interesting note about Sir Richard London's sword, which is another one of these 16th century swords that's being passed off as a 14th century sword. He says, in dealing with Rogers's case for the Wallace sword, so Rogers argued, this is back in the 19th century, that this could be William Wallace's sword because it looks like, or is similar to, the London sword. Now, Sir Robert London, who fought at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in the early 14th century, yes, he is a contemporary of William Wallace, but the problem is that the two swords are both 16th century, but Rogers, the guy writing in the 19th century, didn't understand that. And he went, there's these two 14th century guys, and there's these two swords that look roughly similar, and so they obviously match up. But no, they don't. It's just that the two people were in the 14th century and the two swords were in the 16th century, and they're not associated. So he says, in dealing with Rogers's case for the Wallace sword, something should be said about the sword used by Sir Richard London at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, or not. Actually, this is a claymore, a two-handed sword of a type used by Highlanders in the 16th century, and I would add, and 17th century as well. An alternative tradition that it was used by London of that ilk at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 was published a few years before Rogers made his comparison to the sword. It's still in a private collection, and this author studied it a number of years ago. There's no reason to think that any of it is of an earlier date than the 16th century. Should just note that the London sword is a Highland claymore. The Wallace sword is a lowland two-handed sword. Okay, so he says the term lowland has been assigned in recent times by experts on the basis that such weapons are associated with lowland families. That's absolutely correct. The lowland two-handed Scottish sword looks completely different, or to me anyway, looks completely different to a Highland claymore. Their main defining feature is their crossguard, consisting of a long rod-like quillons at right angles to the blade. The ends are turned down or terminate in knobs, and many have open ring guards on both sides, sometimes with decorative infrills. Yep, completely true. He goes on to give some stats about the Wallace sword and notes some interesting things. I'll just note them quickly. The Wallace sword has a blade length of 131 centimetres and an overall length of 168 centimetres. It's a big sword. The guard's made of iron, of typical lowland form, with two side rings. 16th century. One of the side rings has been bent so that its outer portion lies parallel to the blade. It's kind of squished, essentially. Why would you think you've something with two side rings and one of them's been squished, maybe to put against a wall for display? A crude strap has been welded on, running from one of the quillons to the bottommost part of this ring, and this arrangement is secondary and unusual. Most likely explanation is that it was done to aid to mounting the sword flat against a wall. Yeah, I completely agree. This is... He goes on to talk about other two-handed swords, but this is absolutely agrees with what I think. This was a 16th century sword that was, obviously had some kind of importance to someone, for the fact that they kept it, they'd mounted it on a wall. It was stored in this Wallace Tower in Dumbarton Castle and wrongly assumed to be the sword of William Wallace, but it absolutely cannot have been. Now, I've also made a point in previous videos as well that this author also picks up on. He says, a close examination of the blade examines Rogers's mention of two weldings. Remarkably, the blade as we now see it seems to have been welded together from at least 3 separate pieces. The obvious conclusion might be that the blade has been put back together after having been snapped into pieces. Rogers, ever anxious to see everything about his hero as big, concluded that this was a side effect of an even larger blade being made smaller. That makes no sense at all. The opposite could well be the case, since at least 2 of the pieces don't seem to match up very well. It's kind of wonky. The bottom 67.7 centimetres has, for the most part, a flattened diamond section blade, which is unlike the flattened profile of the upper portion and seems to belong to a relatively narrower weapon. Now that's interesting, I'll come back to that in a second. The other break approximates the position of the ricasso. Possibly this amounts to a single-handed blade that's been deliberately enlarged to give it the appearance of a two-handed sword. A close date could not be put on this single-handed blade, but it might be of 13th century date. This does offer a faint ray of hope for those who would like to believe that this is William Wallace's actual weapon. So I will concede that's not impossible. Okay, it's not impossible that a one-handed sword associated with William Wallace was literally welded up with some other bits of blade from other swords, and then in the 16th century had a two-handed hilt put on it, and it was that there's somehow some part of William Wallace's sword blade contained in that two-handed sword. So there does remain the very, very faint possibility that there is some part of the real William Wallace's real sword contained within this two-handed sword. Do I think that's likely? I don't know. It is very, very odd that this is a large two-handed sword which doesn't have a homogeneous, I always have problems with that word, blade. Why didn't they just take a large two-handed sword which had a blade made of one piece of steel like any other two-handed sword and pretend that it was William Wallace's? I don't know. The fact that that blade's made out of 3 parts does suggest that there's something strange going on there. But I'm not going to speculate anymore. I hope this has been interesting. I know it's been long and rambling. I apologise for that, but I hope that there's been some interesting bits in it. Once again, I'll mention I put the link to this, or what you can see of it. It's not all visible because it's an online version, but you can buy the book if you're interested enough. I'll put the link below here. And I think that what we can conclude is that in the late 19th century, for nationalistic and political reasons, there were a spate of swords being identified with Scottish heroes of various periods, but especially the 13th, 14th centuries, that are definitely not theirs. Robert the Bruce's sword, definitely not Robert the Bruce's sword. William Wallace's sword, as we see it now, definitely not William Wallace's sword. Is it possible that some little bits of those people's swords are contained within these 16th century swords? Yes, it's possible. I think of all of them, with William Wallace's sword, it's almost most possible because his blade is made of parts, whereas Robert the Bruce's sword, as far as we can tell, is definitely just a 16th century two-handed sword. Nothing strange about it. And Robert de London's sword is definitely a Highland claymore of the 16th, 17th century. So, you know, no chance that's got anything to do with the 14th century sort of leader. Anyway, I hope that's been more or less interesting, and yeah, my video that will contain a little bit, like a little flash of this information, will be going on the public website, but you now know some of the research that goes into some of the videos that go up on the main public YouTube channel. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again for my next Patreon video, and of course I'll see you over at YouTube as well. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.